A lot of you, and we're delighted that you're here. Today is going to be a little bit, can be a little bit more difficult emotionally for a lot of us to handle. So I'll warn you about that up front, and you have seat belts on, so you might want to be able to strap your seat belts in, because we're going to move very, very quickly to begin with as we go through the end of the Civil War. We're going to go through Reconstruction, or the lack thereof. We're going to talk a lot about politics today, the politics in the South and the politics in the North that caused a lot of things to happen during Reconstruction, or again, as I like to say, the lack of Reconstruction. And then we're going to move into the Jim Crow era, and then we're going to move into the Civil Rights era, and we're going to come all the way to today. And we may end up talking about, last week we started out with narrative. And if you'll notice the slide behind me, it says narrative versus history. So we're going to talk more today about, right at the end of my presentation, about narrative and how we are still today subjected with narrative that just doesn't play out well. And it's, more about that later. But anyway, I am very glad to see you back. I received a lot of really nice comments last week about the presentation, and I really appreciate that. And I would hasten to add that Ken Burns, who you all know, I'm sure, as a big producer of great programs for PBS usually, has a program that just ended last night, a two-part series on Benjamin Franklin. And it was really, really good. I saw it. Did any of you see it?
Yeah.
Oh, did you? I saw it. And I was really pleased that last night they talked about the Constitution and the formulation of the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention and all that kind of stuff. And he said almost the same things that I told you all last week about why slavery was not mentioned in the Constitution. And for those of you who were not here, the word slavery does not appear in the Constitution of the United States. And they also talked about if the South economically had not agreed to sign on to the Constitution, there wouldn't be a United States, at least not during that period of time, and probably for a long time thereafter, and the formation of the United States might have been a lot different. So these very wise people sucked it up. It's sometimes like going to the polls. You go to the polls and you bite your tongue and you vote for whoever you feel you have to vote for sometimes. But they did that. They saw that the formation of the United States was far more important than the issue of slavery, at least at that time. But it has been the original sin. Slavery has been the original sin of the United States. And it's been a very, very difficult thing to deal with for years. Okay, so moving right along, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, and it was actually started by Lincoln. Now, let's see, somebody told me, Kathy and Alec, I'll get it out in a minute, Kathy and Alec, our new next door neighbors, actually saw Lincoln last night on TV. If you haven't seen that, oh, did you? Yeah, watch that on TV. It is really, really good, and
it's on Prime.
It's on Prime.
Prime.
Yeah,
it's free.
Right.
Oh yeah, it's just about
Yeah.
the end too.
I'm sorry.
I think just a few more days and you can't get it on Prime.
Oh.
Oh, really? Okay, but anyway, you can get it now. So
Yeah.
if you can, watch it. And if you have to cough up $3 or $4,
Yeah.
it'll be well worth it for you. So
Daniel Day-Lewis is amazing.
He does the best. I've heard a lot of historians and other people say he does the best portrayal of Lincoln that anybody has ever done. And he also the atmosphere that he presents in the White House of people coming and going and how open everything was. And really, really, very, very, very well done. So I'd highly recommend you watch that. It'll tell you about the 13th Amendment and the difficulties that he had getting the 13th Amendment passed. Then we have the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to enslaved and African Americans, not just enslaved African Americans, but to all African Americans in the United States. So they were all granted citizenship. And why were they granted citizenship? We talked about this before. It's a constitutional issue. They were granted citizenship because they had to be
Counted in determining the allocation of.
That's different.
Represented.
No, that's different. That's different. Lacey's talking about the 3/5 of blacks being 3/5 of a person for congressional representation in the House of Representatives.
Well, that did
But that's
away
not what I'm talking about.
Did away with property, right? That were not, you couldn't call them property if they were citizens.
Partly. We'll talk about that later. But the big reason was they needed to vote. The Constitution of the United States says you can't vote in the United States in a United States election if you're not a citizen of the United States. So before they could do the suffrage issue, before they could deal with that, they had to be made citizens. So they were made citizens, and then they got the right to vote in the next, in the 15th Amendment. So anyway, that kind of sets the stage for where we are. So all of these are constitutional rights. Now, these can't be abridged, but we're going to see how in the South these were abridged later on. Okay, Reconstruction started in 1865. Excuse me, actually Reconstruction started before the end of the war because it was obvious that the North was going to win the war, and Lincoln started putting Reconstruction together. He started a vision of Reconstruction that he shared, and his vision of Reconstruction was very generous toward the South. Now, you have to understand that at this time in our history, we have Democrats and we have Republicans. Today, we still have Democrats and Republicans. But the lines between the two political parties were very clearly defined in those days. And if you're a Democrat, you're not going to like what I'm going to say, but I'm going to tromp on your feet, and I'm going to tromp on a Republican's feet, and we're just going to tromp on everybody's toes. But you have to do that because it's history. The Democrats brought you slavery, essentially. If you'll recall, last week, one of the things that I talked to you about was how the Trail of Tears, or the Indian Removal Act, if you remember that, of 1830, was brought about by Jackson. Well, Jackson essentially formed the Democrat Party that existed in the South at that time, that existed in the United States at that time. And it was Jackson and his cohorts, his Democrat friends in the South and politicians in the South, that brought about the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And why did they want to get the Indians off? So they could move people in and farm that land, because that was good cotton farming land, because if you remember down the East Coast, the land had been kind of worn out with tobacco, and it wasn't very fertile, and they didn't have any way to restore the land like we could today, so they had to move west. They had to find new ground, as we used to say up in the mountains. They were looking for new ground, and they found that. But in the South, all of the South was solidly Democrat. All of the South. The North was solidly Republican. And you'll hear me talk in a minute about radical Republicans in the national legislature following the Civil War. But anyway, Reconstruction was this era after the Civil War. It lasted from 1865 to 1877. It ended in 1877 when federal troops were removed from the South. It's kind of complicated, but the North had just kind of lost heart. The Civil War was actually won because of the fervor of the North against the onerous specter of slavery. Slavery was just an abomination. And Lincoln, when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as we said, if you were here last week, didn't free any slaves, all it was a motivator to bring the North to a different level. In other words, the North got into the war initially because they didn't want to see the Union separate. But by 1863, the war was not going well. So Lincoln had to do something to motivate the North. So he brought this emancipation thing forward, And so the reason for the war changed from separation to emancipation, to freeing the slaves. So in the North, once the slaves were freed, they struggled with Reconstruction for a while. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But by 1877, they finally said, essentially, the South created this problem, and so we are going to just let them solve it. They made it. The slaves are now free. They're freedmen, as they were called in those days, or freemen, and we'll just let them deal with it. They created the problem. They're going to have to deal with the slaves. And so that's essentially what happened. And they just, oops, there we go. So that's why Reconstruction ended. It was the challenges of reintegrating the states into the Union that had seceded and determining the legal and social status of black citizens of the United States. Oops. Okay. As I said earlier, Lincoln had a very liberal, a very generous view of Reconstruction. And we'll go through these real quick. Before he was assassinated, he formulated this plan of Reconstruction, and I told you about that earlier, which was lenient toward a defeated South. He planned to grant general amnesty to those who pledged an oath of loyalty to the United States and who agreed to obey all federal laws pertaining to slavery. Although high-ranking Confederate officials were not brought into the government, actually they were. That kind of fell by the wayside. Lincoln's plan also stated that when a tenth of the voters of a particular state had taken part in the election and had agreed to take an oath within a particular state that they would be loyal to the United States, that state could be brought back into the Union. And you, whose name just flew out of my head, asked me a question or two last week, and I actually had to respond to him after the thing was over with. But what was happening was certain states were coming into the Union. You asked me how many states it took to make a majority or the three-quarter majority so that constitutional amendments could be passed. Well, that was very flexible in those days because states were coming into the Union. Some were in, some weren't in. Tennessee, for example, was the first state to come back in. Some of the other states were really late in coming back in. So that number changed as things were going along. Okay. Now, the Reconstruction Act of 1865 also was Lincoln. And the big thing it did was it established a bureau for the relief of freedmen and refugees, freedmen being freed slaves. They provided food, shelter, clothing, medical services, and land to displaced Southerners. That means everybody, including newly freed Americans. And the Freedmen's Bureau was to operate during the present War of Rebellion. As you can see, it was put in place before the war ended, and for 1 year thereafter. The Freedmen's Bureau established schools, and the next big one is supervised contracts between freedmen and employers, and they managed confiscated or abandoned lands. All that worked really well for the first part, and then it kind of fell apart. Now, we'll talk about that in a minute. Total population of the South was approximately 9 million people in the 11 states that seceded from the Union. And of that total, 4,000 were freed slaves. Now, during the war, and particularly toward the end of the war, slaves began to migrate out. They began to run away to the north and the north was much closer than it was trying to get to Canada on the Underground Railroad. If they could get to where Northern troops were in combat and action, they were essentially freed. So a lot of slaves began to try to get out of the slavery that way. Issues impacting freedmen or freed slaves, disenfranchisement, integration of freedmen into society, and that was the big issue. That winds up being the big thing, and we'll talk more about that. They needed social and family reorganization. During slavery, families had been split, children had been sold off, husbands or wives had been sold off to other plantations, and a lot of separation was going on. Finding a place in the economy. blacks were really skilled at growing the cotton and the other crops that needed to be grown. The plantation owners, not so much so. And they really needed the black people and their skills and their knowledge and their understanding of how to grow the cotton and the other crops that they needed. So, but finding their place in the economy, blacks were skilled at that, but they weren't so skilled in buying the seed and the other things that were necessary to run an operation or to sell the crop or those kinds of things. So they were weak in that area, and they had to rely on their white overseers and their former white owners to help them with that. And then establishing a shared political leadership. That worked out very well initially, and then it completely fell apart, and we'll talk about that in just a second. All right, here's Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson became president after Lincoln's assassination, and Johnson was from Tennessee. He was a tailor in Greenville, Tennessee, not far from where I grew up. And he was poor. He was not part of the landed aristocracy, not part of the plantation aristocracy of the South. Lincoln chose him because Tennessee was a border state. It wasn't really sold on seceding from the Union. It was the last to secede, first to come back. But because of that, he chose Johnson, and he needed a Southerner to be a part of his administration. So that's why he chose Johnson. Johnson wasn't the strongest guy in the world, wasn't the brightest guy in the world. He maybe slapped the old Jack Daniels a little bit back in those days, but that's who he was. But he also shared Lincoln's view of Reconstruction. He was even more generous than Lincoln in dealing with the South. So Johnson, though, faced opposition from radical Republicans, those Republicans in the North that made up essentially all of the North. There were a few Democrats still in the North, but not many. But the radical Republicans were the people who were really abolitionists. They were hardcore abolitionists, and they wanted to wreak payment from the South and punish the South for starting in the Civil War. Now, if you're from the South, you say, well, that's not so. It was the War of Northern Aggression and yada, yada, yada. But actually, it really wasn't. So anyway, they wanted to punish the South. The radical Republicans did, and they wanted to place freedmen in positions of responsibility in the South. So these radical Republicans were committed to enfranchisement and equal rights for freed blacks. They largely crafted the Reconstruction Acts, and there were several of these. They kept morphing into different things, the Reconstruction Acts. 10 of the rebel states were divided into 5 military districts. I'll show you a map of that in just a second. Only Tennessee, again, was excluded because it had already been readmitted. Rebel states were required to craft new state constitutions, which had to include universal male suffrage. Again, the black vote was very, very important. The blacks could control the South because there were so many freed blacks. And those plans had to be approved by the Congress. They had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Remember, I prepped you about that a little bit earlier, which granted citizenship and equal civil and legal rights to African Americans and former slaves. And Rhodey was right. It made them not property, but made them citizens and people of the United States. After completing the requirements, the states would be readmitted to the Union. Once readmitted, the problem became enforcement of the federal Civil Rights Act statutes after the troops were removed in 1877. And that's what the South looked like. There were 5 military districts. And now, some of the military districts didn't have any problems, but military district 2, 3, they really had a lot of difficulty with the white populations. But blacks were elected to their state legislatures. Blacks were elected to the national legislature. Even one senator came out of the South, black senator. But that didn't last very long. Maybe one term or so, and then all of that began to change. The Freedmen's Bureaus did a really good job early on. The battle to establish the Freedmen's Bureau extended legislation for 1 year, was a major factor factor in the struggle between Johnson and the radical Republicans over Reconstruction and the role of the federal government in integrating the 4 million newly emancipated African Americans back into the system. And that's a photograph that's probably made right after the war. A lot of the slaves, they had no idea what to do. They had nowhere to go. They had no work. There was nothing for them to do. You would think, well, they would all flee to the north. Well, folks didn't want to do that. They didn't know how to do that. They didn't have any way to get there. They didn't want to leave their homes. Even as onerous as slavery was, the plantations that they lived on were their homes, and they had established, in a way, and I'm using this term very loosely, a familial relationship with their owners and with the other people, and they relied on their owners. Their owners fed them, the owners housed them, the owners clothed them, the owners did all of this stuff for them, and then all of a sudden, the owners have no responsibility toward them, and they're lost. They have no idea what they're going to do. So it's not an easy thing, and oftentimes we think, well, the Civil War ended in the spring of 1865. Well, the shooting did, but the war didn't end until the 1970s, and we're going to continue to talk about that. Okay, there was a tremendous thirst among blacks for education and for freedom of religion. And Freedmen's Bureau was charged with establishing schools across the South. Most of these were those radical Republicans who came south. Sometimes people who came south to take advantage of the situation were called carpetbaggers. You may be familiar with that term, particularly if you're from the South. You'll know the term carpetbagger. And they were usually Republicans. There was also a burning desire to build churches for worship. And the black church, along with schools, became the building blocks for black society for the next 200 years, up until today. There's a picture of one of the schools that was built by the freedmen. I don't know where the building came from, don't know anything much about that picture. That is a Freedmen's Bureau school there, a log school built out in the country. And then the black church, of course, was instrumental in bringing the community together, having a place to worship, having a place to talk, having a place to deal with the issues of the day. And that continued into the civil rights movement, because the center of the civil rights movement, center of the meeting places, the churches were being bombed and burned, and little girls in Birmingham were murdered in a bombing. The black church became the center of the community. There's a baptism in New Bern, North Carolina. Some black folks out in the bay there. This photograph represents a Freedmen's Bureau official, an officer in the Army, and he's standing between the whites and the blacks, and he's trying to quell a riot that was about to go on there, over labor probably. Okay, ownership of property. This was another issue where the blacks, again, did not do well. There's always the big story about 40 acres and a mule that my friend Lacey talks about a lot. Well, 40 acres and a mule came about as Field Order 15 was issued by General Sherman down on the coast. And Field Order 15, the Army had a lot of mules that they had used to transport equipment and that sort of thing down into the deep South. And so Sherman kind of took it on his own, playing on the 40 acres thing that was happening in the national government, to give all free blacks families 40 acres. And he also threw in the mule. The governmental thing didn't have the mule thing, it just had 40 acres. And the deal was like any other kind of, what's the term? It's flown out of my head here. Where you go on to property, and if you live on it a certain amount of time, it happened in the West all the time. What? Homesteading. Homesteading. Yeah, squatters. That's a bad term. Bad term, Howie. But homesteading. You lived on the land for 3 years. If you made it a success, the property would be deeded to you, but you actually leased it from the government for 3 years until you complied with that. Anyway, that didn't last very long. The 40 acres and a mule thing was primarily for land along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, and that was land that wealthy plantation owners had owned, but after the war, that land had been forfeited to the federal government. As I said, there's 400,000 acres of federal land that had been seized or abandoned. By the fall of '65, Johnson had pardoned most of the former landowners and their property was returned. The 40 acres and a mule field order was repealed. Through legal actions, the property occupied by the freedmen had to be returned to its original owners. Johnson, as I said earlier, was a tailor from Tennessee. He was poor. He was not big into the landed gentry thing. And he made all of the southern property owners who had more than $20,000 come personally to Washington to ask him personally for a pardon so that their land could be returned. It's just kind of a little personal thing that was floating around in his head. Didn't help things. So the point is that most of that land was returned. Now, some of it, blacks were able to, through legal means and other ways, acquire some property. So some blacks had property in the South. Not too many, but some. A lot of the big plantations wound up getting all of their property back. Problem is, they didn't have anybody to work it. I mean, what good is, 5,000 acres of land if you got nobody to work it? So what they had to do is, and the Freedmen's Bureau worked this out, they worked out land contracts or labor contracts with individual blacks or with groups of blacks. And that's what's going on here. They're negotiating a labor contract. There was also another way of making things happen, and that was through sharecropping. Now, some of you, if you look back into your distant past, if you lived in the South, your family somewhere back there may have been sharecroppers. Anybody in that category that you can? Blucher over here, former governor of North Carolina. That's where his name comes from, right? Former governor. So Blucher's family were sharecroppers. Sharecropping was big among black and whites. Now back here we go again though with the same story. The blacks knew how to farm. Blacks knew how to grow the crop. The whites knew how to buy the seed, buy the stuff that was needed to grow the crops, and sell the cotton at the end. Blacks didn't have that kind of experience, and so it kind of worked. If the sharecroppers were honest with each other, it was not a bad situation. Never a really, really good situation, but it was not really bad. But unfortunately, as happened throughout the South, most of the white sharecroppers continued to look on the black people that worked on their property essentially as slaves. And it was just slavery by another name. That's all it amounted to. And I think I've said all that we need to say about that. Everybody would get a share of the profits at the end when the crop was sold in the fall. Everybody would allegedly share in the income from the property. And here's an interesting thing, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that the black people were just viewed as slaves. If you look in most of these photographs that I'm going to show you, there's always white people overseeing the black workers, as there is in that photograph. And I've never figured this one out yet. This guy's hunting quail, and these people are picking cotton, and I haven't figured all that out yet. But that's in West Point, Mississippi. And a lot of times the poor whites in the South, because a lot of the white folks had been put out of work with the collapse of the Southern economy after the war, and so they also engaged in sharecropping among themselves. And this is a photograph of white sharecroppers working. So it wasn't just black and white, it was mostly blacks doing the work and whites supervising or owning the land, but there were also white sharecroppers also. Okay, the KKK. KKK was formed actually in 1865, right at the end of the war, in Pulaski, Tennessee, down next to Nashville. And General, I don't think of his name, Nathan Bedford Forrest was one of the original founders. We had some friends that lived on Nathan Bedford Forrest Drive in a suburb of Nashville. Now the Klan initially, people were scared to death of the freed blacks. They were, and a lot of this was hyperbole. A lot of it was fake news. A lot of it was narrative, that these black men are going to be raping our southern flower, you know, and so we have to stop this, and we have to keep the blacks under control to prevent this from happening, and they're going to rob, and they're going to steal, and yada, yada, yada. So that was the narrative that was brought about by the Klan. And initially the Klan was, membership in the Klan was by prominent people, you know, judges, attorneys, professional people, very professional people were members of the Klan. And that lasted for quite a while. There were lots of riots going on, like in the second paragraph there in 1866, quarrel between whites and black ex-soldiers erupted in Memphis. 46 people were dead, 70 were wounded. Numerous churches and schools were burned. Then on July 30th, a similar outbreak occurred in New Orleans. A white mob killing 37 blacks, 3 whites, yada, yada, yada. So, and then the Klan still didn't want blacks to be educated, so they attacked the freedmen's schools. They burned the freedmen's schools. They burned the churches. Anywhere blacks gathered and they were getting a foothold in society, they tried to put that kind of stuff down. And the Klan was, again, political thing. They were pretty much all Democrats. And it was actually encouraged by the Democrat political party.
Where did the KKK get its name?
Ku Klux Klan.
How did they come up with it?
It's a kind of a, it came from some Greek words. And what they are, I don't remember. But it was a corruption of a Greek phrase, but it was just all made up stuff. Anyway, in the 1868 presidential election, Republican Ulysses S. Grant won the office. Republicans won, and they got the 15th Amendment passed. And the first Reconstruction Act replaced some of the harsher restrictions on the South, and largely relegated the formation of the new governments. In other words, everybody is all welcome and come back home and yada, 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 and we're all good. But the Klan was getting out of control, and so they passed the Klan Enforcement Acts. It's made it a crime to interfere with registration, voting, office holding, jury service, and all that kind of stuff. More than 5,000 people, as you can see there, were indicted under these laws. A little more than 1,000 were convicted. That kind of attitude still existed in the Deep South in the 1960s. It was next to impossible to get a conviction against a white person for pretty much anything if it involved a racial issue. So that, everybody thinks, well, the Civil War was over then. No, it wasn't. It was just really getting started, and the real vicious racism part of it began during Reconstruction. And in 1882, the United States Supreme Court declared the Ku Klux Klan Act unconstitutional. In the 80s and 90s, racism was absolutely roaring in the United States. It was completely out of control at that point. Okay, very quickly, successes and failures of the Reconstruction Act. The Reconstruction Act ended in 1877 when President Hayes, and his election is kind of an interesting story too. The Democrats and the Republicans kind of wanted to get rid of Grant, but they wanted a moderate kind of guy in there. And so the Democrats and the Republicans actually agreed on Hayes, and in a smoke-filled room, it was decided he was going to be the next president, and he was. And he was going to end Reconstruction, and that's why he was elected. Yeah.
The deal was,
Okay.
because Tilden was one vote away from winning, that there were a bunch of undisputed electors.
Yes.
And the deal was the electors would go for Hayes
Exactly. That's where I was getting to, is you're just providing more detail. He was saying that there were uncommitted electors in the Electoral College, and they did that, and that's the deal that they made, that Hayes would be elected and he would remove the troops from the South, and that's exactly what happened. Reconstruction was a success in that it unified the United States, put the country back together. Still a lot of problems. Reconstruction failed in the United States because white supremacists, the white Democrats in the South, took over all of the state legislatures, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute, and passed very restrictive laws, black codes as they were called, that control the blacks, pretty much put them back into slavery. Racism also became more deeply embedded in the South society. When the blacks were slaves, they were kind of out of sight, out of mind. They were on the plantations or on the farms. They were cared for by their overseers or by the plantation owners, and there was not a problem because they were not out in society. Once they were freed, all of that changed. And then we had to do, the South, had to do something to gain control again. And so that's when this term segregation reared its ugly head, because if we can't keep them controlled that way, we've got to control them some way, so we'll segregate the societies. So that's when segregation came into being. As I said, former slaves were forced to work for next to nothing and were subjected to racist black codes, Jim Crow laws. So the Synopsis of Reconstruction, by 1877, when the last federal soldiers left the South and Reconstruction drew to a close, black people had seen little improvement in their economic and social status. And the vigorous efforts of white supremacist forces throughout the region had undone the political gains that they had made initially, right after the war, as I told you, when they were elected to legislatures and held important positions. Discrimination and segregation would continue in America with the rise of Jim Crow laws that furthered segregation. Resistance to these laws would later inspire the civil rights movement and the passage of national civil rights legislation. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, what are Jim Crow laws? Jim Crow laws are the laws that you all who grew up, how many of you, and you can raise your hand or not, how many of you grew up in the South? Okay, about half. That's good, because we may divide the group and duke it out here before it's over. Between the North and South. We may work this out again. Just kidding you a little bit. Jim Crow laws. There were minstrel shows were big. You know, Showboat. Y'all remember the movie Showboat and the play. Minstrel shows were big, and Jim Crow was the Step and Fetch It character that lived in the big house, and he thought he was a lot smarter than he was, but he was, you know, made up to look like a black buffoon, that kind of thing. But that's who Jim Crow was. And these laws were legalized racial segregation, and they were to marginalize their effectiveness was to separate the black and white races and marginalize African Americans. Who can tell me about Plessy versus Ferguson? Anybody? Plessy versus Ferguson? Go for it. Plessy versus Ferguson.
That was a Supreme Court decision.
Okay, we had a lot of those. What did it say?
I don't remember.
He doesn't remember. Okay, but nice try though. Okay, Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was a mixed race man who lived in New Orleans, and New Orleans had passed a segregated bus laws, actually rail car laws. It's probably on their streetcars. And so Plessy, knowingly and willfully, got onto a white car. And they said, "You can't ride this car." And he said, "Yes, I can." And so they arrested him. And he was prosecuted and convicted of violating that Jim Crow law that had separated the races on the cars. And the state upheld it. And the state Supreme Court in Louisiana upheld it. And then they appealed it to the United States Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court is a wonderful institution, but sometimes in certain eras in our nation's history, they don't make the best decisions in the world. Back when Plessy versus Ferguson, it was the society, not just in the South, but pretty much all over the country, was a very racist still society. So they ruled that Plessy did not violate the 14th Amendment. And they said that if equal, you ready for this? It was the separate but equal. Now you know it. Separate but equal. That's where separate but equal came from. They said if in public accommodations and schools and other things, if the accommodations provided were equal, they could be separated. And that was a Supreme Court ruling that really gave legal authority and legal power to the separate but equal thing, which had a very deleterious effect across the South. That's where you see the
What was the year of Plessy?
I want to say about 1880. Hold on just a minute and I'll get it back up here. 1896.
Okay.
That was a very racist time, as I told you, that the 1880s and 90s.
If you go to the Greensboro train station, you can still see the two waiting rooms.
I'm sorry?
If you go to the Greensboro train station, you can still see the two waiting rooms.
Oh, if you go to the Greensboro train station, it says you can still see the two waiting rooms. But that's where all of that came about. Separate water fountains, separate restrooms, separate restaurants, separate hotels, separate motels, everything. Everything was separated. And if you grew up in the South, you saw all of those things. Okay, and that's, I pretty much told you all about that. And it was a 7-1 decision. It wasn't a lot of dissension about that. Oops.
Did the Supreme Court say they had to be equal?
Supreme Court say what?
Did they say it had to be equal?
Yes.
Separate,
Separate but equal. But
they never were equal.
they never were equal. That's the point of the whole thing, Blucher. The accommodations were never equal. Never. The schools were never equal. It was just a legal ruling to suppress blacks and separate the races and to further segregation.
According to your slide, it says,
I'm sorry?
according to your slide up there, it said had to be equal in quality.
Yeah, but that's just it never happened.
You know,
Did you ever know a black school that was equal to a white school when you were growing up? Okay. Well, you grew up in New Jersey. None of the schools up there were equal. So anyway, I'm sorry.
different viewpoint.
Okay. Now we come to another ruling called Brown versus Board of Education. Who wants to tell me about that? What was that about?
Well, it rescinded separate but equal.
I'm sorry?
It rescinded separate but equal.
Right. Separate but equal has never been overturned. The Plessy verdict has never been overturned. But Brown versus Board of Education had to do with a family named Brown, black kids, and the Board of Education was in Topeka, Kansas. And so they went to they wanted to get their black child in school, couldn't do it because of Plessy, and they kept working forward, and they were, because it's a much later time, 1954, when the civil rights movement was really getting underway. Brown versus Board of Education held that separate but equal doctrine was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment, and that it essentially never worked. And then down at the bottom it says the holding invalidated the separate but equal ruling. Even though it's never been overturned, Brown versus Board of Education essentially did away with it. So we're moving on, but we're 50 years forward. It took us to get to that part, and then back in the early part of the 20th century, things were still very, very segregated. Oops. Okay. So what began to happen was blacks began to migrate out of the South. They couldn't find work. They were being abused by all of these segregationist laws, these Jim Crow laws that every state had passed, and we've just talked about all of those. And there were a lot more of them. They were where you could go, when you could go, restricted movement, restricted times of movement. When I was living in New Smyrna Beach, Florida in the wintertime, I became a police chaplain with the New Smyrna Beach Police Department. And two of my fellow chaplains were black guys who had grown up in New Smyrna Beach. And we spent time together going to seminars and this kind of thing. And I was appalled as they told me about their youth. Now, these guys weren't as old as I was, and they were talking about growing up in the 60s and early 70s. Route 1 runs north and south right through the middle of New Smyrna Beach. And blacks had to stay on the west side of Route 1 after 6 o'clock. Blacks could not be in downtown New Smyrna Beach. And these guys told me of having the police officers pick up people and whack them with their nightsticks and take them back across Route 1. Those kinds of laws existed up until the 70s in the United States. Really a sad situation. Yes?
The sundown laws.
So, yeah, sundown laws. There was a town near us in Irwin, Tennessee, and it had a big sign at the entrance of the town said, "Nigger, don't let the sun go down on you in Irwin, Tennessee." Sundown laws.
One in Mayadan.
Same thing? Yeah. I told you, by the way, if you're going to be offended by nigger and those kinds of words, you probably should leave, because it's not going to get better, because we're going to talk about things as they were, not as we want them to be. Anyway, blacks began first to move, and we were talking about we were talking about homesteading. Blacks moved to Kansas because that was the closest state that allowed homesteading for black people. So a lot of the blacks initially moved west out into the Midwest, and then Oklahoma, you can see there, was also had a lot of big Indian population. So the blacks were accepted there, and though they made significant moves north and west, at the turn of the 20th century, over 7 million of the nation's almost 9 million blacks still lived in the South. But that was about to change. Okay, the Great Migration was a movement of some of 6 million African Americans from rural areas of the southern states to urban areas in the northern states between 1960 and 1970. It occurred in two waves, basically before and after the Great Depression. And the first big one came probably in the early part of the 20th century, just before World War II, because the before World War I. World War I was building up. The Industrial Revolution was really going. There were just jobs everywhere. All kinds of jobs were needed in the North. And the blacks weren't the only people that go there. I grew up in Appalachia. It's not pronounced Appalachia, for those of you who are from the North. I grew up in Appalachia, and a lot of people that I knew, including some of my family, went north to work to make cars and all that kind of stuff. It was just a movement. You went where the jobs were, and a common line on the bottom of the letter would be, "Write if you find work." Some of you may remember that, or had family members who did that sort of thing. Okay. Primary reason for this migration was segregation, indentured servitude, and convict leasing. We haven't talked about convict leasing, but these Jim Crow laws, you could arrest a black person for just about anything. And they would be put into jail, and they would not have the money to pay a fine, so they would go to work for the county in a chain gang or a work gang. And then oftentimes, earlier on, those work gangs would be hired out to local plantations. So it was just slavery by another name. This is going to sound really ugly, but when I first went in the FBI in 1968, racism was still pretty strong in the United States, in the North where I worked, and cops had a code phrase, and you would say, what was he arrested for? And he said he was arrested for BAN, being a nigger. That's why he was arrested. That's terrible. That's terrible. But that's the way the world was at that time. So anyway, spread of racist ideology, widespread lynching, lack of social and economic opportunities. We've talked about the other thing, labor shortages brought about by World War I, pull of jobs in the North was strengthened by labor agents who actually came south to recruit blacks to go north. And they would pay their way, give them money up front to live until they get established, yada, yada, yada. Let's see if I can see anything else in here. Oh, the decline of European immigrants. Jim's folks had stopped coming from Ireland in droves like they had in the previous century. So you can see how European immigration dropped off and labor forces were needed. And a lot of the immigrants who had come to the United States from Northern Europe had done better. You know, they had gotten education, and even some of them had even gone to Harvard, and they were doing really well. So there was a need for black laborers in the North. So that's what happened. And there's a photograph that I found I thought was really cute. And I really liked that because look at how they're dressed. The people are really dressed well and appropriately for that era. That's probably early 20s, I would guess, somewhere around in there, just judging from the way they're dressed. Yeah, August 30, 1920, if I read my own notes down there. Okay, now I'm going to bore you to tears. So just get ready. But I think it's important because we all have our own stories that deal with how we dealt in our personal lives with racism and with black people. If you look at that part that says Roan Mountain, Tennessee, if you see under the I and the N in that northeastern corner of Tennessee, you see that's a really light yellow color. And if you look up in the north up there, it's light yellow, and in the south it's deep red. But if you look along the North Carolina-Tennessee border, you see there's a line of light yellow. Where I grew up was in the high mountains of eastern Tennessee, right on the North Carolina border. And we were, during the Civil War, my part of the country, were Northern sympathizers. And we had been, quote, for a long time. We were not part of we were kind of like Johnson. We were not part of the landed aristocracy. We didn't have the plantation thing. As a matter of fact, we didn't much like the plantation thing. We didn't much like the landed aristocracy idea. People there were small independent farmers, small merchants. My family were merchants, that kind of thing. And going back for years, decades, slaves would flee to that part of the mountains. And the people who lived there, the white people, would hide them and or protect them. And if you were a slave hunter, it was not a good idea for you to be coming up into that part of the mountains looking for people, because it was the same way that people used to come in there and look for stills. Sometimes they didn't make it back out. So it was, and during this Jim Crow era, we didn't have black and white fountains. We didn't have black and white restrooms. My mother ran a restaurant. So we never had blacks and whites seated in other places. Sometimes the black people would be seated outside because they had been working and were all sweaty and nasty and dirty. But my mother taught me and my brothers to treat everybody alike, and she did. She followed that motto herself. So anyway, where I grew up, my father died when I was 3 years old. And I was raised by my mother and my grandmother and my grandfather, who died when I was 7. So my mother worked for my aunt and uncle, who were some of the wealthier people in town. They had several businesses. And she worked in their dry goods store. It would be like a Walmart today. They had everything but food in the store. But anyway, when she would work, and then my grandmother would take me around in the afternoon when I was about 5 or 6 years old, 4, 5, 6 years old. And she would go visiting to our neighbors. And back on the hill behind us a little ways, a couple hundred yards, was a black couple named Lynn and Tilly Avery. And they had 2 children, Nick or Nicodemus and Ellie or Eloise. Nick and Ellie, and they were just great people. They were just marvelous people. Lynn drove a coal truck because everybody's house in those days was heated by coal. You had a warm morning. Anybody ever have a warm morning heater in their living room? Boy, we must be, oh, Lacey and I are right on there. That's how our house was heated. Other people had coal furnaces, but we didn't have a coal furnace. And then in the summertime, he drove an ice truck. He hauled ice around. Great guy, really helpful in the neighborhood. And Tilly was just as sweet as she could be. Her name was Matilda, but everybody called her Tilly. And she would work occasionally for my mother. Now, it wasn't a racial thing because my mother wasn't home and my grandmother was getting kind of elderly. But if other women, Dorothy Decker or Zora Markland, were available, they would come and help my grandmother out. If Tilly was available, she would come. And just the other day, I had something that just warmed my heart because I always had such a warm feeling for Tilly and Lynn Avery. I have a friend who was born about 100 yards from where I grew up. We started in the first grade together and went all the way through high school, and she now lives in Kernersville with her husband. And we were talking, we were having dinner the other night, and I happened to mention, I guess I was talking about this class, and I happened to mention, I said, you know, my understanding of blacks was much different than most of the other people in the South. And I said, do you remember Lynn and Tilly Avery? Do I remember them? I spent half of my life in their house. My mother would take me up there and I would play with Nick and Ellie and on 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 and on. And that's the way, but that's the way it was. And they lived just above us. We saw them every day. And so another place that my grandmother would take me was down under the hill. And these people were not doing as well as the other family that I just described to you. Their last name was Smith. Now, we had two Smiths in our neighborhood, two John Smiths. One of them was John Smith, a white guy who lived, again, up on the hill behind us. And the other Smith, John Smith, was called Always, and it was not a pejorative term at all, but you'll take it that way, some of you will. He was always called Nigger John Smith. And his wife was Aunt Ella, or Aunt Eller, as we called her, but her name was Ella. And they lived in a converted chicken house. A chicken house that had been converted into a dwelling house, as we call it. And Aunt Ella was just as sweet as she could be to me, and they were probably maybe 70s, late 70s, 80s. They were elderly people. But we would go visit with them, and she would give me cookies, and we just had a great time. And an incident that I remember about, and I don't know if it was racism or what it was, but one day the main highway ran right in front of our house. And the Trailways bus out of Charlotte would come through there. And I had a next door neighbor whose name was Bill Kuntz. And Bill this was right at the end of the war. I mean, we're talking 46, 47, right around in there. Bill was in the 82nd Airborne Division. Had done several combat jumps during the war, was not somebody to be trifled with, maybe had a little bit of PTSD. Anyway, he was waiting to catch a bus to go somewhere, and Nigger John was across the street, and words were exchanged. And Bill turned on his heel, went around behind the house, and we knew bad things were about to happen. And I was literally standing on my front porch with my grandfather, Big Dad, and we were watching all this. And Big Dad, when he saw what was going on, some other men came and got Nigger John and moved him out of the area. And about that time, Bill comes walking around the house with a 9mm German Luger in his hand. Bad stuff was about to happen. My grandfather, who was a great man, stepped down off of our porch and confronted Bill and very gently took the gun out of his hand and put it in his pocket. And Bill caught the bus and went on his way. But that's the kind of way it was in our immediate neighborhood. And I grew up in probably a middle class home. We had a nice home and all that kind of stuff. And there were people in our neighborhood, in our community, who were excellent I told you that my aunt and uncle were fairly wealthy people and owned some businesses. Well, these buildings here were built by Jack Avery and his brother Tom. They were black folks, and they were, we would call them today general contractors, that kind of stuff. But they could do anything. I mean, Jack and Tom they could lay brick, they could put on roofing, they could do anything. And they built these buildings that you see here, these brick buildings, down to about the Coca-Cola sign. They built all of those buildings, and they were all owned by my aunt and uncle. And where that Coca-Cola sign is, there was a little restaurant there called the Maple Lane Coffee Shop, and that was owned by my mother. It was a little restaurant. So anyway, I grew up among black people. During the summertime, some of you would be playing tennis or out on the farm, out on riding your horses, out on your summer plantation or home and whatever. But I was cutting cabbage and picking beans and baling hay, and I was working for whatever it was, 50 cents a bushel to pick beans or whatever it was. And young black men and adult black men were working with me in the same field for the same amount of money, doing the same job. So we were all together, we were all one person. And then there was an older than I, he was in probably his mid-20s, named James Avery. Now you notice a lot of these folks their last name is Avery. It's from the Waitstill Avery plantation, which was up next to Morganton. Waitstill Avery was a general in the Revolutionary War in North Carolina. But anyway, his name was James Avery. James was very well read. He was very, very bright. He would shop in our store, and I would drive him and his groceries and his feed, and all of that kind of stuff in our pickup truck. I would drive him to Buck Mountain, and we would talk, and we got to know each other. And James was much better read than 99% of my neighbors. He was bright. He knew everything. He was up on, and it illustrated to me that black people can be really, really smart folks. And I learned that, and I learned it from James Avery. And his family, his wife, and he had a son and a daughter. A few years later, his son and daughter went to school where I had gone to school and did quite well, both athletically and academically. Great, great folks. Before I get to the Army here, I want to black that out. My first real job, as I told you, I worked in my brother's store, and I got one of the salesmen came into the store one summer. I was 20 years old, I guess. It was 1962, and he said, no, I was 19, and he wanted to know what I was going to do that summer. I said, well, I'm going to work in the store. He said, how'd you like to come work for me over in Bristol in my warehouse? And they had a wholesale grocer and restaurant supply business, and they supplied food and coffee to restaurants and hotels and grocery stores. And I said, sure, why not? Made 50 cents, no, I made $1 an hour. Big money, big money. I went from, 50 cents a bushel to $1 an hour. So I go over there. I had no car back in those days. So I get over there. I rent a room in a house that was close to the where I worked. That was a grandmother of one of my college classmates. I was beginning my junior year in college. Yeah, I was beginning my junior year in college. And so I go in and I meet the guy that owns the place, and then I meet the guy that I'm going to be working with every day. And he was a black gentleman, about my size. He was probably, I thought he was ancient, but he was probably as old as Rhodey is here. He's probably 70 maybe, somewhere in that area. And his name was Willie. And Willie, his job was to take beans that came in from South America, coffee beans, and he would select them out and roast the beans and grind the coffee. And we had the best smelling place in the world. But we also worked in this unair-conditioned warehouse, metal warehouse, unloading railroad cars and trucks with a two-wheel hand truck from into the building. It was not a pleasant experience, and I can still remember when Willie first met me. He looked at me and said, "This young college man is not going to be much help at all to me." Well, I had been used to hard work all my life. So anyway, after a week or so, Willie warmed up to me, and we became really, really good friends. And he could work me into the ground. I mean, into the ground. And we became fast friends and got along really, really well. And I learned a lot more about working with black folks at that time. Then I went in the Army. Commissioned, went in the Army as a second lieutenant after I graduated. And after all of my training, my first real assignment was at Fort Rucker, Alabama. Now, for those of you who don't know, that's in UCLA, the ugliest corner of lower Alabama. Anyway, I was assigned as the weapons platoon leader of B Company, 5th Battalion, 31st Infantry. Now you can see here we are having a presentation. We're actually promoting some folks. That guy, the sergeant here on the front, now that's been, gosh, at least 50 years ago. And I can still tell you his name. Sergeant Gentry was one of the best NCOs I ever had as an NCO. He was also one of the worst human beings I ever had to deal with. We got more calls from his wife about issues going on in their family, but he was a really good NCO. Anyway, that's my company commander, and we're promoting the white guy there, and then there's a black guy standing beside him, and he was in my platoon. And we were probably making him an E5. He looks like he's a Spec 4 there. Now you can see me, I'm the little bitty munchkin standing between those guys in the back. See, everybody see me back there? Yeah. Now look at the guy on my right, on your left. See that tall, distinguished looking black gentleman? That's my platoon sergeant. My platoon sergeant. Sergeant Emmanuel Jose. And when I met Sergeant Jose for the first time, it's one of these things, you know. I'm looking up at him, and he was a magnificent NCO and a magnificent human being. And he said, Lieutenant, and I didn't know squat. I mean, I was dumb as a box of rocks. He said, this platoon needs a commissioned officer, and you and I are going to bring them around. We're going to make them into a combat-ready outfit. I said, Sergeant Jose, you tell me what you need to do, and we'll get it done. And we worked together, and the platoon immediately saw that we were a team, that this black man and this white man were working together, and that you better pay attention to what they say, because Sergeant Jose is in complete charge, and I'm just kind of hanging on. But that's who he was. Still remember him to this day. I later became the company commander of this company, and he was the still the weapons platoon sergeant, and he and I still, during all that time, were just like this. He would come to me, and I would call on him when I had issues that needed to be discussed. Here's another promotion. The guy standing back over my shoulder there, you can barely see him. His name is Colonel Archie Summers. He had been in the Army long enough. He was in the 8th Air Force, was a pilot in the 8th Air Force, and flew in Jimmy Stewart's squadron. So shows how long. And I'm promoting this young man here, and he's got a little bit of a tude going there, you know, a little bit of attitude working as I'm promoting him. Great guys. They were just, I hold them in the highest regard. All right, here we are at the Peanut Festival Parade. This is B Company, 5th Battalion, 31st Infantry, and the company commander is leading a platoon in this parade. Now, for those of you who are in the Marine Corps, if you want to learn how to march, I want you to look at the left foot of everyone in that photograph. They're all flat. Nobody has even lifted a heel yet. That is people who are well trained. And they're well trained by all the black folks that are in that platoon. If you'll look, you see the guy carrying the guidon. Your guidon bearer was one of the top people in your company, and you selected him, and I guess they selected him, but I approved of him. He was my guidon bearer. He was also my driver for my quarter ton, my Jeep, as you guys would call it. But we were on a parade there, and if you'll look, you'll see that probably half of the people in that photograph are black. black soldiers. Okay, now I'm a company commander. March 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday, Selma, Alabama. We were in lower Alabama, as I've told you, southern Alabama. That was not very far away. And if you all recall, this occurred one Sunday afternoon, and we received a call from 3rd Army, which was our next higher group, and they told us to prepare to escort these marchers the next week. President Johnson had wanted Alabama to protect them, and they would not. George Wallace, Democrat governor, would not support and protect the marchers. So I can still remember this. You saw that colonel that I mentioned to you? We're having a commander's conference on Sunday afternoon. And he says, he's giving out the orders, and we're not going to fix bayonets and yada, yada, yada. And he's giving us all the do's and all the don'ts. And I said, sir, my order to my troops is, and I know at least one person will know what I'm talking about, is if anybody assaults them, if it's a Alabama state trooper, sheriff, deputy, anybody, my order is horizontal butt stroke and hold. And he looked at me just like this, he didn't miss a beat. He said, B Company will be held in reserve. And thank you, sir. So it worked because he knew I meant every word of what I was saying. Those black men, those white soldiers were my responsibility. I loved every one of them. And if you haven't been in a command experience like that, you won't understand the word love in that context. But I was not going to have anybody harm one of my soldiers. Now, to make it worse, here's what was going on. We were beginning to take a lot of casualties from Vietnam. And because we were in the Deep South, we had to perform burial details for Army soldiers who were killed in a war. We would I put together a burial detail, and my NCOs would handle 99% of it. And we would send that burial detail over to southern Mississippi, let's say, because we had to cover pretty much the Deep South. This was during the Jim Crow era. If they had to go overnight, the troops had to go overnight, we had no motels to put them up in because I'm sending racially mixed burial details. We had no place to put them up. We had no restaurants for them to eat in. And when the worst thing that happened was when we got to the funeral home to bury Bubba, they would find out about it, the funeral director would, and they would tell the family, and they would come to whoever was in charge. It wasn't me, I always had somebody out. They would say, the white men can participate, the blacks can't.
What year was this?
1965. And my orders to those guys were, if that happens to you, you get back on the bus, on the military bus, and come home. You will not do that. The irony and the saddest part about this is that the man who was killed in the company of black soldiers. And he would have been honored to have been buried. I break up there, I'm sorry. He would have been honored to be buried by these same men. Now that's how onerous these laws, these and the attitude, the racist attitude was so prevalent in the South. I want to show you one more thing and then I'm going to get off of me. But you can find me in that photograph. I'm behind that black gentleman there. That's Sergeant Andy Andrews. He was the darkest black person I have ever known, but he was the nicest guy. He needed to be promoted. He was as you can see there, he's about to be promoted to a staff sergeant. He was my communications sergeant. And my first sergeant and I wanted to get him promoted, and we finally got a strike down. But if you were promoted to this next stripe up, you stood a good chance of being on the next levy for Vietnam. So we called Andy in and we said, Andy, we got a stripe for you. You deserve it, and we want you to have it. However, it's going to potentially put you on the list to go to Vietnam. Do you want the stripe? He said, yes, sir, I want the stripe. So we gave him the stripe. And that's the day when my first sergeant is standing right up behind me, Sergeant Cheryl, myself, and there's Andy. Now the rest of this story is, if I can get through it, is maybe a month or so after this happened, Sergeant Andrews came to the first sergeant and said, I'd like to see the company commander. And nobody really wants to see the company commander, because two things happen. Either something really good or something really bad is going to happen. But he wanted to see me. And first sergeant knew how we all felt about Andy. He was a great NCO. So Sergeant Andrews comes in and he reports and he says, sir, he said, my wife is pregnant and the baby's to be born in a month or so. And he said, if it's a boy, I'd like to name him after you. Now that is probably one of the highest honors that I have ever had in my life. Somewhere in this world there is a Thomas Aaron Andrews walking around, a young black man who was named after his dad's company commander.
Hair?
I'm sorry?
Does he have hair?
Well, Andy had hair. I don't know if he does or not. He probably doesn't. Anyway, there's the real commanding officer of the whole, that's the brigade commander standing beside me there. Okay, then we get the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was a movement whose time had come. It was time to resolve some of these issues. And some of these radical Republicans and young students from the North came down again and started doing voter registrations and that kind of stuff. And three, young civil rights workers, Schwimmer, Cheney, and oh goodness, it flew out of my head. It'll come to me in just a second. Anyway, they were killed, buried in a dam. The FBI finally found their body. And by the way, that was before I was in the FBI, but I knew a lot of guys who worked the Klan in the South. If you want to see a really good movie about the Klan and what it was really like, find Mississippi Burning and take a look at it. It's pretty accurate, pretty good stuff. It's a little bit theatrical, but it's pretty good stuff. But anyway, this civil rights movement came about, and it came about with a woman named Rosa in Montgomery, Alabama. And what did she do?
To give up her seat in front of the bus.
Akin to Plessy, right?
Yeah.
Plessy didn't give up his seat, and neither did Rosa Parks. Now, everybody thinks, well, this was just a nice black lady who was going to work. No, this was all very carefully choreographed by the NAACP and the civil rights movement. She was selected to do that. She agreed to do it. She was the right person to do it. She was a non-confrontational kind of person, and it worked out beautifully, and it started the civil rights movement. Now, the civil rights movement was very successful, had tremendous leadership, had tremendous support. The people in the North and a lot of the people in the South were seeing the onerous nature of what was going on, and that we needed to change our attitude in the United States about civil rights and about black people. And so that's how it all came about. We talked about Brown versus Board of Education and all of that before. All right, Civil Rights Act of 1957. That was the first Civil Rights Act that was passed. There have been a bunch of Civil Rights Acts passed. Now, you see a name there, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson was in the Senate at that time, and he was a Southern Democrat and a racist of the first order. Now, you can deny it. You can say, oh, no, he wasn't. Yes, he was, because he usually referred to this bill as that nigger bill. And when he was talking to Southern Democrats, he had to work out some reason so that the Southern Democrats would vote for it. It's kind of like the Constitution, or it wouldn't happen. It wouldn't get passed. So what happened was, you see the words watered down in there? He worked out a watered down version that the Southern Democrats could choke down, and they passed this first civil rights bill. It was like a bucket of warm spit. It was just worthless. There was really nothing in it. Didn't amount to anything. Pardon my rather direct language. I was back in the Army or somewhere when that happened. Okay. Anyway, the Civil Rights Act of '64 is a little bit different. It's a little more But the civil rights movement now is getting moving. It's really going. And a lot of the Democrats are beginning to see, along with Johnson, there is going to be a tremendous, if these Voting Rights Acts are approved and we get this through and the society changes in the South, all of these black people who have never voted in a federal election are going to register to vote, and it's going to change the voting dynamic of the United States. And we want them to vote Democrat. Now, the irony of some of that, though, is that when Johnson was running for the presidency in '64, that's when all of this was going on, okay? But Johnson was only on board for the political benefit that he could get from the black vote. But he was contradictory. For example, in Mississippi, a black lady named Hamer and some white college students put together the Free Democrat Party of Mississippi. And they came, Fannie Lou Hamer, she always liked to be called Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, and her delegation came to the convention, the Democrat convention in Atlantic City. And they went to the Credentials Committee, and they requested to be seated as representing the black people of the state of Alabama with this Democrat Party. And they denied them. And Johnson was kind of, whoa, what are we going to do? And so he didn't know what to do, so he sent Hubert Humphrey, his running mate, down there with a letter from Mrs. Hamer, and they said, okay, here's what we'll do. 2 black people can be seated, but neither will have voice or vote. And Mrs. Hamer made this really remarkable, impassioned speech and said, pound sand. We ain't going to be a part of it at all. And they got on the bus and they went back. Now, that's what the politics was like in those days. It was not, people think, well, Johnson was this warrior for civil rights, and he did all this stuff for the good of the people. No, he didn't. Initially, he did it for the good of the Democrat Party, for his own party, to get the black vote, hoping that the black vote would stay with the Democrats. And that's pretty much what happened. So anyway, Voting Rights Act of '65 on August 6th, it's exactly what I've just been talking about. Prohibits discrimination in voting. The South had put together literacy requirements and other kind of educational requirements that nobody could pass, and all of that stuff was struck down because all of those Jim Crow laws were blatantly unconstitutional from beginning to end. Okay, we got just a few minutes. I've run over, but we have kind of got down to the end of the thing here. So I will allow you, if you want, to give me one racial incident in your past, if you would care to. Make it short, but if you have something that you'd like to say about what we've talked about, and Layla always has something to say, usually to me.
I grew up in California and completely oblivious to all of this going on.
Yeah, give her the mic.
I'm coming. I thought I could reach.
And let me just say, Layla, blacks went to California very early on. Even before 1860, they were migrating to California and the far west.
Well, anyway, growing up in California, I was very unaware of all of this going on, and I went to college in New York, and I think it was my junior year, about 1955, Martin Luther King's father came and spoke to my history class. There were only 15 in my class, and he talked to us about the civil rights movement that was going on, and he implored us to supply bicycles for the movement.
Workers. Yeah, great. Who else? Front row. Pass the mic up. Nancy Gibbs.
Well, I attended Greensboro College, and from 1959 to '60, I was a freshman. And that's when the 4 students from A&T went to Woolworths and sat down to be served. And of course, it was all over the news, and my parents were seeing it all in Virginia, I mean, it looked like a riot downtown. You know, it just looked worse than, I guess. We weren't allowed to go down there. The president of the college said, you'll be kicked out of school if you go. So we didn't go. But anyway, my parents were calling me, are you involved in that? Are you down there marching and doing anyway? So, but when I graduated, I was a social worker in High Point. And we had a black social worker to come over once a week. She had foster care. And we'd all go to lunch together with her. And the restaurant, anyway, the K&W had just opened up to blacks. And so she would come and go with us, and everybody would stop eating in the restaurant and stare at us. And I'd say to myself, why in the world is everybody staring at us? And then I'd think, oh, that's right. Frances is black. You know, I mean, we didn't see her as a black social worker. She was a co-worker. She was one of us, and it just blew me away that everybody would stare because she was there eating with us.
Thank you.
We were on a trip out west. I don't remember when it was, but I remember a couple that we had met or something asked us or asked me if, since we were from the South, if we still lived on plantations. And this was like, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago.
And you said, yes, since we moved to River Landing, we do.
This isn't a,
Go ahead, you're on.
working?
Yeah.
This isn't exactly a story about a racial encounter, but it's one of the most important conversations and discussions that I ever participated in my life. I was about 19 years old. I was in the Army in Europe in a group of young men, lily white. We're all whites in this unit, not a black man to be seen. And not long after the Brown and Board decision, we happened to be sitting around in the barracks and got into a discussion about it. And the breakdown by region that these boys came from was fascinating. The kids from the Northeast, like me, were sort of latter-day abolitionists. We thought that what was happening in the South was just terrible, and the treatment of the blacks and all this. The Southern boys argued, well, it's states' rights. I mean, it's our problem and we'll take care of it. The kids from the Midwest, Chicago, I remember specifically, were the biggest bigots I ever saw in my life. They just hated black people, period. I don't know if that was unique to the Midwest, but it certainly was to these people. The people from California were people from California, you know, just didn't have much of an opinion. So, like I say, that was a very fascinating conversation that I had on this whole issue.
Thank you.
My senior year at Cornell, the university made the cover of Times and Newsweek because on parents' weekends, the blacks took over the student union, kicked out the parents who were staying in there, stayed there for 2 or 3 days, then came marching out carrying shotguns and bandoliers of shells, held news conferences up. Basically, classes were disrupted a little bit because people were talking about this rather than learning anything. Eventually, though, one of the leaders wound up being on the Cornell's Board of Trustees, which I thought was also interesting.
And as they were leaving, they were singing "High above Gauga's waters."
is an awful smell. Okay. Well, thank you for those. I just want to say just a couple of other things. This is, we started out with narrative, okay? And we were trying to I was trying to illustrate to you the difference between narrative and fact, narrative and historical fact. And this is an inconvenient truth that we hear today about the BLM movement. Now, these statistics that are in here are from the FBI. They're from what's called the UCR, the Uniform Crime Report. Every police department in the United States that receives federal funding, that would be everybody, is required to participate in this. And these are the statistics, and this is the sad part about where we are today with racism in our country. Blacks make up 13.4% of the population in the United States, yet they accounted for more than half of all the homicides in 2019. Now think about that a minute. According to the Uniform Crime Reports for 2018 and 2019, 87.7% of offenders were male. That means that approximately 7% of the population, black males, committed approximately half of the murders in the United States. Whites were 51% of known race homicide victims and 76.5% of the total U.S. population, while blacks were 45% of homicide victims, but only 13.4% of the United States population. This means that the homicide rate for blacks was 3.3 times their percentage of the U.S. population, making them over 5 times as likely to be homicide victims. You can't argue with that. You can't argue with those kinds of numbers, and there are the numbers for you. That's the uniform crime sheet that has that information, and you can see the numbers that are highlighted in red out to the right. And the numbers for people, young black men, is even higher than for the adult population. And the problem, though, is that we want to follow a narrative, and we want to say, well, blacks are being killed by rogue white cops. Well, there's almost as many black cops now as there are white cops. And that's just simply not true. And before we can move forward with the racial problems in the United States today, we have to deal with things on a factual and on a real basis. We can't establish some narrative like we did with 1619 that I was talking about with you earlier, and try to make it fit and try to make it work. When we try to do that, we distort truth that needs to be surfaced so that we can manage as a nation all of these issues. Now, a lot of folks today like to say that the United States is a systemically racist society. I personally don't believe that. Now, you can believe that if you like. I don't believe that's true. I think we were systemically racist. I think we were just absolutely atrocious until in the past maybe 30 years. But opportunity now is available to anyone who wants it. Education is available. Jobs are available. And there are very active penalties for engaging in that kind of discrimination. And that's appropriate and as it should be. But we need some time. We need a little, as they used to say during the Cold War, we need a little détente. We need a little lessening of the tension on the string. We need to relax a little bit and let things work out, let things happen. But we can't do that if we're not truthful about our current situation. And I'll say this to you, everyone here has had a racial history of some kind, and we are as responsible as anyone else for healing our own selves as much as we can by facing our own situation and by facing the actions, perhaps, of our families, the people before us. Thank you all so very, very much for coming. This has just been a wonderful presentation for me. I don't know how you thought about it, but